This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Greg Wadley with CTC and Associates. I'm the Clear Roads Administrator. We're here for the final webinar for the project entitled Synthesis of Technical Requirements and Considerations for an Automated Snowplow Route Optimization RFP Template. This research effort is led by Jonathan Downs at the University of Vermont. Before I turn it over to Jonathan, I want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted on the Clear Roads website at a later date for viewing at your convenience. We also ask that everybody stay on mute so that there's no background noise, and also please keep your camera off to increase the bandwidth. However, if you have any comments or questions, please do enter them into the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So I think that's all for the housekeeping items. So I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan. It's all yours.
Thanks, Greg. And thank you to all the members of the Technical Advisory Committee who are on the webinar today. As Greg said, this is our final webinar for our route optimization project, looking at how we can support DOTs in contracting with this kind of services. To provide you with a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we'll just review the project purpose and the guidance documents that this project was intended to produce. Go through how these documents were developed. We had an initial data collection phase that included a review of literature and RFPs on recent route optimization projects, as well as a survey of practice, reaching out to DOTs and other transportation agencies that have used this technology. We then went more into depth on the state of practice with agency staff and vendor interviews, and this is really the meat of the project here, as far as understanding what makes these projects successful, what makes these projects challenging, and how we can set up RFPs, contracting processes, and that sort of project management throughout to ensure that these projects are successful and result in routes that are implemented by the agency at the conclusion of the project. Then we'll do an overview of the guidance document, including I want to talk about the process of getting TAC and vendor feedback, since I think that was very important to shaping this final document. And then we're going to do what I'm calling an optimization project walkthrough. So throughout the guidance documents, we explain a lot of different decision points, and we provide recommendations for what we think would be the best way to launch a project that had the highest potential resulting in implementation. And so this is my effort to consolidate all those recommendations into a single place, say, this is the process and structure I would want to go through if I were in charge of a winter maintenance division and wanted to bring a route optimization project to my agency. So the project purpose here, we're really motivated by the fact that this optimization technology, this automated routing software, has, grown by leaps and bounds in terms of its mathematical and technical proficiency over the last decade plus, and has the potential to yield some significant cost savings when implemented well. But the contracting process for these optimization projects and getting them through the final implementation phase remains challenging. We don't have a lot of examples of successful projects in this arena. So the objectives for this project were to provide a clear understanding of what all of those technical requirements are that need to be considered in a project to make sure that it's successful, that the routes are safe and feasible and implementable, and then to provide a flexible template to assist with the development of RFPs and contracts. So we really have two final deliverables here, as well as the final report, and really what the final report does is document how we got to these two tools and sort of direct you back to them. So one is a decision support guidance document. This is supposed to be highly accessible. It's plain language, so that somebody who does not have a optimization background, who does not necessarily have a background in computers or anything like that, people who are working in the maintenance division can read through this, say, okay, I know what the decisions I need to make are, and I know how to convey those to contractors and vendors using this contracting language to ensure that we have a shared understanding of what the project needs to produce for us to get routes that we will then use. And of course, using the routes is where you see the cost savings. If you develop routes that don't change your practice, then there are obviously no savings that accrue to the agency. Though there can be important lessons learned, but you know, we're really looking at getting to the next step here, not just lessons learned about our routing, but like how can we change the routes to save money, to save time, to improve performance. So what these two documents look like here, this is just a very quick overview. The decision support document, again, is going to be a plain text. It's going to describe what the decision points are, step by step, all the way through the routing process. And then in parallel to it, we have our contracting language template, which can be used to build out the RFP. This is a very modular document, so depending on what decision you make, you have paragraphs of text for each of those decisions. And definitely I would encourage people who are interested in this process, who are interested in this project that we've done through ClearRoads, is start with a decision support tool. This is really what will help you get a good grounding in what route optimization looks like, what the key decisions are. If after reading through that, it seems like your agency is at the point where this is something that you should pursue, then you can go to the contracting document to build out that RFP. So to develop these guidance documents and contracting documents, we started with a review of literature and RFPs for recent optimization projects, and then an online survey of transportation agencies that had engaged in route optimization projects. This was really find out who's been in this arena, what's worked for them, what are the requirements that they had for that project. So really develop a database of transportation agencies that might participate in the interview process, same thing on the vendor and consultant side, and to start to catalog those technical requirements that needed to get all those decision points that needed to get built into our final documents. Building on those RFPs and scopes of work, we started identifying on our diagonal here some common elements and technical considerations. Don't worry too much about the details on this. I know it's small and busy and hard to read. This is available in our final report. But the things that I wanted to highlight here is that we have a lot of variability in what had been included in scopes of work, including in some like fairly central technical considerations. So just highlighting two here across the 5 of these scopes of work that I was able to fit on this slide. Only one of them specifically talked about including wing plows and what side of the road a plow needs to be operating on as one of the technical considerations that needed to be embedded in the optimization. Only 2 of the 5 specifically stated that we need to consider what speed the vehicle is traveling at. And both of these are really fundamental to the optimization project. They're things that need to be included and they need to be thought about. So this sort of points to the opportunities for a project such as this one to provide transportation agencies with a clearer set of technical recommendations going in. Now those aren't going to be missed in the project. An agency, the consultant or software is going to require some inputs about plow speeds, but thinking about things like that on the front end is really going to improve your project success. And again, just minimizing left turns, minimizing crossing major routes at uncontrolled intersections. These are some aspects of winter maintenance that are really important to the safety and feasibility of routes. And again, we only see a few of the RFPs like specifically mentioning these technical considerations. So after doing this RFP review, we launched our survey. We had responses from 12 agencies that used 4 different optimization software packages or consulting firms, and a varying rating of project success. I wanted to highlight here a few of most of this was a 1 to 5 scale or a yes, no, we've done this or not, but we did have an opportunity for respondents to provide some longer text answers. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of these that really hit themes that were common throughout this project. The first is that there are a lot of technical barriers that can arise in this project, the optimization process. So we had one agency that used a left turn strategy for clearing intersections. This was, I believe, a municipal agency rather than a state DOT. And the way their project was set up and the way their vendor conducted that optimization, the vendor was either not aware of or failed to implement this left turn strategy at intersections. So in general, there are many agencies that want to avoid left turns. This agency wanted to utilize them as part of their winter maintenance strategy. That was not conveyed to the vendor or not incorporated in the optimization. And so the key takeaway for this respondent was make sure that the vendor is fully aware of the technical expectations, right? So here was a matter of something that was core to their winter maintenance practices that was not included in the optimization. It ended up resulting in routes that they couldn't use and felt were too far from usable to even be modified to be successful. Then there are also institutional barriers that come up again and again. North Dakota DOT had a project that they viewed as technically very successful. They liked the routing that was produced, but it did result in a lot of changes to the structural components of their winter maintenance. It involved moving garages, moving vehicles, moving people, reducing routes. And they pointed to the difficulty of reducing operators and garages in terms of gaining institutional support for the process, and that there was a lot of political pushback on that. So managing expectations is something that's come up a lot specifically from the vendor side. They feel that the DOTs haven't always been successful in doing that, and then even when they get routes that they like, there can be some barriers on that side to getting these routes implemented. And a note on project structure. Some agencies have done this in-house, and many have worked with external vendors to do the actual optimization. This is North Dakota DOT again. They said that there was a pretty big ramp up to learn to use the software. They didn't use it all that often, and so ultimately it was difficult to retain expertise with that software. And so their recommendation was, unless you have somebody who's going to be dedicated to using it, to work externally with a vendor to conduct the optimization. So after this initial data collection phase, we moved on to agency and vendor interviews. We talked with 6 transportation agencies, 5 of them DOTs and 1 Council of Governments in Connecticut, trying to select projects to get a variety of different perspectives. Some of them, like the North Dakota project, highlighted some of those organizational barriers to implementation. Some of them were in-house, as Wisconsin DOT's was. Some of them used project-specific software. So we tried to select agencies that had worked in a sort of project with a number of different configurations. For the interviews, we had a fixed template asking about what we thought would be key elements to go into our guidance document, what the contracting and execution process was like. So that included questions like whether or not it was done in-house or externally, who was responsible for the input data, what was the project duration, whether or not it needed an extension. Again, all this is summarized in our final report. Questions about the optimization and purpose. So were agencies most interested in saving costs? Were they interested in minimizing the time it took them to provide winter maintenance operations? And had they considered things like the optimization of garage locations, the number of vehicles that were used, things of that nature? We were also interested in the operational constraints that were included in the optimization. This is really where a lot of the technical infeasibility comes. If you don't have something like turn constraints well articulated, if you don't have vehicle capacity constraints, how much salt, brine, etc. a vehicle can hold and how quickly it spreads that, in the optimization you'll result in routes that are either infeasible or unsafe. And then what were the outputs? How did those directions look? How did it lead to implementation? And particularly if not, what were the lessons learned about why things fell short of implementation? There's some common lessons across these interviews that came up a lot. One was that getting to implementation is hard. Most of these projects did not result in implementable new routes. Wisconsin DOT was one of the standout exceptions there. They have been doing their work in-house, and so have been able to gradually, incrementally work with counties to roll this out, but it has not been an instantaneous process. And that the implementation barriers are both on the technical side, as I mentioned, and come from institutional resistance to change. Generally, as I mentioned, the optimization software was operated by an external consultant or vendor. It does have a steep learning curve and requires a fair amount of time commitment to use it. And finally, that though the route generation process, once you have all of the inputs in, give us a set of routes. While that is highly automated, there's a lot of upfront manual work on the data preparation side and on the route revision side. So you have to be prepared to have staff time on both the front and back end there to make sure that the final routes are usable. I'll highlight a few of the barriers to implementation on the technical side that came up in multiple conversations. One is issues about the compatibility between your winter maintenance vehicles and different roadways. There was an instance where an agency received routes that took a vehicle from the interstate where it was operating with a tow plow and clearing multiple lanes down some ramps and other areas that just it was physically incompatible with. So obviously those routes were not ones that could be used in that setting. So making sure that the vehicles and the equipment match the roadways. Sometimes this is also things like we use a particular material on some roads but not others. All of those kinds of considerations. Safe turning movements. These are large vehicles operating under difficult conditions, often U-turns and left turns that may look feasible on a map are not safe, and so those need to be avoided. And then turn lanes, multi-lane exits, roundabouts, all of these things that are a little bit different from just your main line blasting down the interstate circumstances. Those are areas where it's really important to be clear about what the agency's practice is in order to make sure that the routes reflect how those roads are to be treated. On the institutional side, there were a variety of issues that came up that led to pushback on routes that were considered feasible. Sometimes this was a matter of the scope being too ambitious. As I mentioned in that North Dakota project, there was a lot of moving of resources from one side of the state to the other. I think they even did some garage relocation that would have required some upfront expenditures. So there was just too many moving pieces for it to be something that could be shepherded through to implementation. Lack of consensus on performance targets is also a really important one, and I want to just dwell on this for just a minute. Especially if what you're trying to do is minimize costs, you have to be very clear on what is an acceptable service standard or performance target for a route. So if a route needs to be completed every 2 hours to be considered acceptable, and currently there is a truck that goes over it every hour, the optimized route will move from a faster route to one that is closer to that performance target, to that 2-hour cycle time, to potentially drop other vehicles to save cost. So if 2 hours is not actually an acceptable standard, but that's what's used as the basis for the optimization, you're going to get routes that are going to get a lot of pushback either from within the agency or from the public. An inability to demonstrate that the routes improve upon existing practice is also a big problem when you're trying to convince people to change their practice. So this is where you really need good baseline data about what is happening currently, how fast our vehicles are going, how quickly they're completing the routes, all of that stuff. If you don't know, if you can't document what you're doing now, then it's really hard to make the case for doing something different. And finally, staff inertia can be a big issue. People have been doing a certain thing for extended periods of time in some case. They have a lot of expertise in their own area and can be reluctant to embrace change. All of this can be managed to some degree with upfront involvement of staff at all levels of the agency kind of from the get-go to build expectations for what the outcomes might look like, including maybe we're going to cut some vehicles, maybe a specific individual road is not going to be serviced quite as quickly as it was under the old method, but it will still be done within an acceptable performance target. So, working on that upfront management of expectations to overcome some of these institutional barriers to change. All right, so with some of those big themes covered that came out of the interview process, I'm going to jump now into an overview of our 2 guidance documents before getting into that walkthrough where we incorporate our recommendations that are embedded in the guidance documents into what I think a good approach would be to building a initial route optimization project that had a high probability of success, defined as changing winter maintenance practices on the ground to use new routes that save a DOT time and or money. So to hit our guidance documents again, we've got two parallel documents. One is the decision support document and the other is the contracting language template. Again, start with the decision support. That's going to tell you what the components of the project are in a way that is hopefully easily understandable and then can be mapped right out of that contracting language document. These 2 documents are very parallel in their structure. They both cover key issues like the optimization purpose, the optimization scope, what are the data needs and sources, what are the winter maintenance operational practices, such as vehicle operating speed, material spread rate, that influence the outcome of the optimization and need to be reflective of the DOT's current on-the-ground practices. A route review process. As I highlighted in that survey, while the computer component, the generation of the routes is optimized, there is both pre and post work that requires input from the DOT. Those routes need to be reviewed to make sure that they're safe and feasible. Even with a really good project with your winter maintenance practices well embedded into the software and the optimization with good assumptions, there are probably going to be intersections that need to be tweaked, turns that need to be tweaked. It's just unrealistic to expect that every detail of the mapping data will reflect everything that's going on. So build in time for this route review process and do take it seriously. And then the documents also cover some other key considerations about when you might want to do these projects, what would make it successful. And on the contracting template size, it also includes a set of project tasks to bring this to a conclusion. I want to highlight for just a minute the vendor review process here. This was something that was built into the initial request for proposals for this project, and it was something that I was really impressed with and thought that it was made a lot of sense to include in the project. Right, what we're trying to do is bridge a gap that exists between DOTs who are experts in winter maintenance and software providers and vendors who are experts in route optimization but don't necessarily know as much about winter maintenance specifically. When we launched the project, I know there was some concern about how engaged the vendors would be. I think there was another Clear Roads project that asked for vendor feedback that got a relatively limited response. I was really pleased with the level of engagement that we got from the vendors. It was C2 Logics, Anera, RouteSmart, and Vaisala that participated in initial interviews and then also provided feedback on the written guidance documents. In general, the feedback was very positive. It didn't result in dramatic changes to either of the documents. And I think this reflects, one, that we'd worked very closely with our DOT interviewees, with the TAC, and with the vendors in earlier stages of the project, so that there was a really good cohesiveness to those documents from the get-go, and they did reflect the technical capabilities for route optimization. But at the same time, the vendors also provided some really good specific feedback that did change elements of those documents. So for example, we've talked a lot about optimization purposes and saving time versus saving money, and you have to have one of those specified as your primary optimization objective. One vendor pointed out that you could do a hybrid approach. If you were doing a statewide optimization, you might want to be minimizing costs in one area and minimizing the time it takes to provide winter maintenance services in another area. So we incorporated that into the guidance documents. Some very technical, narrow suggestions, such as the importance of having information about pavement lane width, because depending on how a plow is equipped, it can potentially clear an area wider than a single lane as it is, as is marked. So having the actual pavement width helps to look at that. We had one scenario in the guidance documents of a sort of blue sky facility location optimization. So do you want the optimization process to consider all of the different places that you could put your garages, then place your garages, then do your routes? And two of the vendors really pushed back on this and said, look, that's just a whole nother can of worms. That's a whole nother place where these projects can fail. It's the upfront cost, it's the complexity of the different routes from there. And so we added language really cautioning against that approach in there. So again, was very pleased that the vendors were so responsive to this. There were a couple of suggestions that were, really, I think, sort of trying to steer us towards particular outcomes and particular services that the individual vendors offered, and we mostly did not put those in the final documents. But overall, thoughtful feedback, specific feedback, and I think it really strengthened this Clear Roads project to have that in there. And I think it's as I said, it was not a part of the project that we thought of, but one that was in the initial RFP, and I continue to think that was a really good component of this project. I'm going to walk very quickly through the components in these guidance documents, and then get into that project walkthrough. So how would I do it? How would I recommend doing it if you are looking to get into snowplow route optimization? The first thing to consider, the first thing that is in this guidance document, is that there are different optimization purposes. The primary purpose of an optimization can be to minimize the cost of providing snow and ice control, or it can be to minimize the service time required to provide snow and ice control. And these two optimizations produce different route systems. And if you're looking for one thing and you get the other, you're not going to be happy about it. So we want people to really understand this as sort of the key first decision. I have a couple of simple examples, sort of what those look like rather. So very simple road network here, being serviced by a garage with 2 vehicles. On the left side with the routes in blue, this is what a cost optimizing optimization would produce. Single vehicle covering all of the road segments, so there's no road overlap. Again, this assumes that vehicle can complete the circuit within the cycle time that's specified by the agency. And then you can potentially eliminate that vehicle. You can reduce driver time, and there's no deadheading when vehicles are overlapping on the same route. But it does mean that some road segments are not serviced as quickly as they are when both vehicles are utilized for providing plowing. So on the right side, we see what it would look like if you were doing a service time minimization. This routes both vehicles immediately. We see the red vehicle covering the north-south segment of the road, the blue vehicle covering the east-west segment of the road. This means that the east-west road is done faster than it would be done in scenario A, but that in that segment of road immediately above the garage, before the intersection, you have both plows covering the same segment of road, creating some cost and efficiency. So you're trying to minimize cost, or are you trying to minimize service time? Another example here on a slightly different road segment. Here, you need both plows in order to complete the this road segment within the cycle time target. If you are trying to minimize costs, what you would do is you would send the red plow to the left, the blue plow to the right. You would have no overlap between those routes. They would have pretty different lengths. They would have pretty different times to completion, but costs would be minimized. The time to complete the last road segment, so in a service time minimization, you would actually send them both in a single direction, have some overlap, but then the blue plow, which now has a slightly longer route, would finish half of the road segments at the same time that the red plow finished the other half of the road segment. So everything is plowed, everything is hit once by the service vehicle in a faster, in a shorter time period than with the cost minimization approach. So again, we just want agencies to ask for which of these they want, so that the routes they get reflect what they're looking to do. The optimization scope is the next big decision point here. What is the geographic extent of the project? Are you going to look at doing something statewide, covering all plow routes, all garages and facilities, or are you going to look to do it on a pilot scale? There's a trade-off here between the potential cost savings, which are highest in the statewide scenario, versus a sort of the risk of an unsuccessful project. So with a pilot region, it's going to be lower cost because it's a smaller area. It can build confidence in the optimization process, but you don't have quite the potential for savings that you do for a statewide project. Then we're also looking at what types of scenarios, this next component, what optimization scenarios do you want to cover in your project? So this includes things like what kind of routes are you seeking treatments for? Or do you want routes for straight plowing, for spreading materials? Do you want to consider variable weather severities? Is it just, hey, this is what we're doing for the average storm? Or do you want to consider more severe storms as well? Are you going to consider garage locations in that? Do you want to optimize where your facilities are located, or do you want to consider them to be fixed? That's not something that you're going to be able to change, so potentially so consider that to be fixed. Service territory boundaries often reflect things like political jurisdictions, county edges, things like that, that aren't necessarily reflective of where the optimal division of services. So should those be fixed? And should you look at moving vehicles between existing facilities? Those are all things that are part of the scope of the document, and you can come up with a variety of different scenarios with different components here. Doing additional scenarios provides you with additional information, additional opportunities to say, okay, what would it look like this way? What would it look like that way? But again, since that route revision process takes a good bit of time, there's also a trade-off. You don't want to end up with so many routes that people don't have the time to review them, or that you don't know which ones to implement. Another key component here of launching one of these projects is making sure that the right data is available. This can either be done by the agency sort of in-house, which lowers the project cost, or by a consultant if it is not available. So one thing that you need is the road network. Base data here often comes from the DOT. Many states have GIS road layers for their jurisdiction. But since these aren't specifically designed for snow and ice control, it typically requires some modification by the consultant or the staff member operating the optimization software. And we go into some detail about that in the guidance document about what kind of modifications might be needed. You also need information about the winter maintenance fleet and its equipment, vehicle sizes, vehicle material capacity, where vehicles are located, all of this sort of thing. This is generally fairly easy for a DOT to provide. It's a fleet table with truck types and equipment types, but may require some restructuring to go into the optimization. Finally, you need to know where the facilities are located and where the service territory boundaries are. Again, this is something that's usually readily accessible to the DOT, but is also not hard to create. Existing snow and ice control route data is not technically essential. The software can create a new set of routes without comparing them to the existing snow and ice control routes, the existing winter maintenance routes, but it is very important for demonstrating cost and performance improvements. So identifying what is available in terms of documentation for the existing winter maintenance routes is also important. And then snow and ice control operational practices, winter maintenance operational practices should be reviewed at the project launch meeting, including supervisors and drivers, so that, again, the optimization software will reflect the operational practices as far as turn movements, et cetera, that are actually used by the DOT. Our recommendation that we provided in the guidance document is to provide sample data for as many of these elements as possible when you're issuing the RFP. This will provide folks who are interested in responding to the RFP with sort of the clearest example of what your data looks like and what needs to be done. So it'll allow them to scope the project a little more tightly around your specific needs. You know, the amount of time needed to modify a road network could vary considerably depending on what that looks like in its base data. So again, provide sample data for as many elements as possible and let folks tailor their response to your needs. The project tasks that we laid out for a route optimization are this project launch meeting. As thorough as we are trying to make this RFP and using our contracting language template, and as much information as we are trying to provide in there, good communication between the winter maintenance division and the individuals conducting the optimization, whether that's DOT staff or an external vendor, is really crucial. So this project launch meeting is a place where you're going to need sort of widespread involvement from DOT staff, regardless of who's doing the optimization. The bolded items here, tasks 1, 2, and 4 are the places where DOT involvement, winter maintenance staff involvement is going to be most critical. So data acquisition and preparation, we sort of walked through that a minute ago. I won't go too much into depth there, but just making sure that there's a clear understanding of where that information is coming from, what's included, what's not. The route optimization is both the key component of this whole process and also in some ways the most trivial, right? Once you have good data inputs, once you have your snow and ice control fleet in there, once you have your road network well represented, you know, that's something that's running on the computer. It will spit out a set of routes. Those can be formatted in a bunch of different ways, typically in a GIS layer, but you know, printed turn-by-turn directions, printed maps, you know, variety of things there. But they're not going to be perfect. They're going to be optimized according to those inputs, and I guarantee you those inputs will not capture every single local consideration. So this is where a route review comes in. We're really encouraging people to take that down to the level of the supervisor or the driver, get somebody out on that route, drive it, maybe drive it with the plow truck, see what it looks like. Are there turns that don't make sense? Is it treating an intersection incorrectly? And then bounce those back to the team doing the optimization for route revisions, which are in task 5. Hopefully things like this project setup minimize the number of revisions that are needed, but absolutely that's got to be a task that's built in as well. Task 6 is the only one that is sort of somewhat optional. It's the comparison of the old routes versus the optimized routes in terms of time to complete, vehicle hours of travel, costs, you know, whatever your metrics of success are. And again, you can create optimized routes without doing a comparison to your baseline routes, but it's just going to make it a lot harder to convince people that they should change options. And then the final report documenting the process, documenting what the final input data was, transferring that data back to the DOT in case it needs to be used for future projects, documenting the gains in time, cost, etc., for the optimized routes, and providing those routes in the format specified in the project RFP. All right, those are our guidance documents. There's a lot in there. The sort of last part of the presentation that I want to walk through here is what does it look like to take these documents, to take the information from this project, consolidate sort of the recommendations there, and come up with a project that is manageable, feasible, and going to lead to the highest likelihood that you're going to have implementable routes. So I'm calling this part the project walkthrough. These are the decisions that I would make, knowing what I know based on the interviews with the vendors, based on the interviews with the agencies that have worked with us so far, to our own experience doing an optimization project for the state of Vermont several years back. So prior to the project initiation, there are three things that really need to be evaluated. One is the level of organizational support for an optimization project. You know, it's all well and good to say we want optimized routes, we want to make sure we're being efficient, but if that efficiency involves things like we're going to drop trucks, we're going to drop drivers, or we're going to use drivers, you know, they're going to have less overtime because they're not going to be working as often. Roads might not be plowed as quickly as they once were. You know, all of these changes can be barriers to getting routes implemented. So make sure that there's a high level of organizational support from leadership down to the supervisors and drivers. Like, have people who are committed to making the project a success at all levels. How good is your existing baseline data? Do you know how quickly your plows travel currently? Do you have it well documented what the spread rates for your vehicles are? This is going to make the optimized routes more realistic. It's also going to let you demonstrate that the optimized routes improve upon existing routes. And lastly, what is the level of clarity and acceptance of the agency's existing performance targets? Often these performance targets, these cycle times, are one of the key mathematical components of the optimization. So if there's not good agreement on them, it's a really challenging piece to use as a component of an optimization. If you don't feel good about all three of these, don't start an optimization project. That is my advice. There are a few caveats to that, right? You can still do an optimization project if you're interested in what is the potential scale of savings. We want to sort of look at our routes in a general way. There definitely you can have a lot of lessons learned out of a project. But if you don't have these three and you want to implement new routes rather than doing sort of a more exploratory project, pause here. Maybe the existing data is its own project. You know, whether that's getting someone to analyze ADL data, working with your GIS team to make sure that we really have good route data. Maybe that's its own project before you launch an optimization. Maybe there's public outreach around the performance targets that needs to be done so that people understand our cycle time target for these roads is 90 minutes. If we hit that 90 minutes, we're considering it a success. You know, but do the upfront work here before launching into an optimization. A few additional considerations once you've resolved those first three issues. What's the agency trying to accomplish? What is the optimization purpose? Is this primarily about saving money? So doing a cost minimizing optimization, or is this primarily about increasing service time? And those do have decreasing service time. And those do have different outcomes. Cost minimization is much more likely to try and leave vehicles idle. That's one way that they save money. They'll both reduce route overlap potentially, but again, know what you're trying to accomplish. And then, is this something that we want to do in-house, or is this something that we want to do externally? This really depends on staff availability and how often the optimization would be revisited. If you are a state that is actively adding more lanes, more roads, are in the process of updating garage locations, your optimization may change significantly in a relatively short time period, and it might be worth re-optimizing annually or every several years, in which case maybe it makes sense to develop the internal expertise to do the project in-house. If it's likely to be a one-off, your road system is relatively static, then that might be a circumstance where you'd be more likely to want to go with an external consultant or vendor. On the staff availability front, there is a learning curve, and many DOTs sort of said, okay, you do the optimization, but train our staff in the tool. Nobody who was trained in the tool but who wasn't using it regularly and putting significant time in it ever went back into the tool that I heard about in our interviews. So if you want to do it in-house, that's going to have to be somebody who's going to have like a significant portion of their time dedicated to learning the tool, using the tool, and working in it on an ongoing basis. Then these optimization scope components. Here are our recommendations for the different aspects of that scope. For the geographic extent, I would recommend piloting it in a sub-state region. Try and get an area where the road network has some complexity. There are a few projects that were done in areas where you had a couple of fairly straight legs of an interstate. The optimization isn't going to improve much on intuition there because the optimal routes are just easy to discern at an individual level. So try and get a region with some road complexity. Try and find an area where there's a lot of support among at least the district supervisors, ideally the drivers too. Prove that the process works on a pilot scale before trying to go statewide. As far as scenarios go, I would recommend something on the order of 2 scenarios. I think it makes more sense to do material spreading routes than plow routes. Salt, brine, capacity, etc., is often a more limiting factor than fuel. There are more locations where you can refill with fuel often than salt or brine. So those spreading routes will generally work for plowing, but the plowing routes may not work for spreading if they are if they cover more distance than you have the capacity to cover with salt. My recommendation would be to consider both average storm severity and a sort of extreme storm severity. Looking at sort of a high storm severity is your back test. Will these routes be good enough to hit our targets when we are most strained? And then you can look at what the differences between those. They may be pretty similar, but those are sort of the bounds that I would do. What are we looking at on a typical storm? And then do those routes hold up if we have a much higher storm severity that requires an unusually high spread rate, unusually low vehicle speeds, things like that, just sort of to bound that. Service territory boundaries, those can be flexible. You don't have to adjust any infrastructure to adjust those, and you can potentially find some cost savings there. But keep your facility locations and fleet allocations fixed. Building a new garage, moving a garage is costly, unless that's like very actively in the plans. Use the locations and facilities that you already have as the basis for the optimization. Otherwise, you're going to have routes that are, starting in a location where you don't have a garage and won't be usable. For the project launch, the important thing here is that you're building the right team and that you're really having a good conversation with the people who are conducting the optimization. So you need leadership represented there because you're going to need to have support at a high enough level to sort of push through some of those barriers to change. You need your project champion, who's the key liaison with the optimization team. You want somebody who knows about the GIS and data resources that your agency has, and you want supervisors and drivers who, when you start going through those operational considerations, they can be the reality check about what's happening on the ground. And then with that team, you also want to have a detailed discussion of the winter maintenance practices to make sure that those are accurately reflected in the optimization tool. This includes things like, what are the desired turning behaviors? Where can and can't vehicles make U-turns? Do you have, interstate crossovers that are available to your winter maintenance vehicles that might not be in your GIS data layer? What specialized equipment is being used? What vehicles do or do not have tow plows or wing plows? Are you doing echelon plowing? What's happening on your multi-lane roads as opposed to just your rural single lane highways? What's going on with exits? What's going on with any oddball features? Do you have bridges that need where the snow and ice control treatment varies significantly from the road around them? Do you have roundabouts that you have to treat? And especially if they're multi-lane roundabouts, is there particular patterns that your snow and ice control, that your winter maintenance vehicles need to utilize to get that clear? The vendors by and large are aware that these things are issues and considerations, but you want to go over them to the greatest extent possible, surface all of these issues at the launch of the project, because it's going to minimize the amount of route revisions that are required. And this brings me to sort of the last part of this walkthrough, and then I don't know if there have been any questions in the chat, but then I can address those as well. And this is the route review process. Do it, DOT it early. Do it early is what that was supposed to say. Take it seriously and drive it. So the computer-generated routes will have things that are errors or that are infeasible in reality. So build in time for the route review, and get either a supervisor or a driver who's going to be covering that route to physically move along it, identify any problems, identify any classes of problems. Often these tweaks are relatively minor. Everybody who is going to conduct a route optimization is expecting to be doing this route revisions based on this route review. There's going to be often just manual adjustments. Generally, it won't necessarily require rerunning the optimization software, but they're going to be, all of the minor changes that make your routes safe and feasible, and that get buy-in from the drivers who have to be out on the road in snowy winter conditions while following these routes. So those are the parts of the optimization project that I see as real keys to ensuring success, and sort of the decision points that I think make the most sense for a DOT that is doing its first optimization project. Obviously, once you've done a pilot, then you can look at rolling out statewide. But those are where the recommendations that we make based on the interviews and data collection that we did for this project. Very grateful to the members of the TAC, many of whom provided very useful feedback in this or pointed us towards people that we should be in contact with. The agency staff at the DOTs that participated in the interview process were all very candid, very generous in sharing their time and answering follow-up questions, and also to the vendors who contributed their insights to the project. My email and Jim's email are available here. you know, this project is wrapping up, but if you are, you know, launching or considering launching an optimization project and want to have a phone conversation, ask any questions, bounce things off us, I'll be more than happy to be an ongoing resource for people looking to engage in the optimization process. I think it's a technology that has a lot of promise, and you know, with a well structured project could you know, bring a lot of benefits to DOTs. So that wraps up my prepared remarks. I believe, Greg, officially we have until 12:30. So if folks have questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. It was a good presentation, very thorough. So yeah, we don't have any comments or questions in the chat box right now. So I would invite folks that are on line here, if you do want to go ahead and take your mics off mute and just go ahead and ask a question, that'd be fine. So we'll give a little bit of time for that. See if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, Jonathan, this is Scott Lucas with Ohio DOT. I understand what you're saying about the locations, about not putting those in there, about as one of the, I guess, the variables in the beginning of that. But had anybody talked about using the system and maybe seeking out different locations? Like we've had a situation where we've had like maybe 2 locations or maybe 3 locations in a county we'd like to put a garage at. But that's it, just their locations. But then doing an optimization program for each of those locations. I know it's a lot of work, but would that be something feasible, or is that something that still would be too complex, do you think?
Scott, that's a great question. Mostly what I'm trying to push back against, in part on the basis of that vendor feedback, was sort of that blue sky, let's consider everywhere approach. I think it's much more viable to consider a smaller set of alternatives like that. If you say, okay, we've got 3 locations that we're considering. In that case, you know, you can potentially skip sort of the route reviews and revisions. Route from the 3 potential locations, you know, if one is head and shoulders above in terms of time or cost savings, then you can just do the detailed review of the routes from that garage and just make the revisions from that garage. So you're tightening the amount of work there, and that could be a really good way to select amongst those candidates where you have a limited number of options and you're trying to evaluate sort of their relative effectiveness and efficiency.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Well, I guess I had another kind of comment or question. I did really enjoy the final findings, especially the comments from the vendors and everything like that. It does confirm a lot of things that we went through in our route optimization projects. We went through like 2 different phases of that, and really neither of them were very successful. But it's nice to see that at least we weren't alone in that, and that it isn't something that I guess is just off the shelf. But I guess one thing that I did ask, do the vendors have hope, I guess, in the future? Would they think that as technology moves forward that it would be more simplistic, or they just think it's more of a buying into the data kind of a thing from the supervisions, or what? I guess that's what I'm kind of looking at as a future. If we'd want to try this again maybe 5 years from now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that the vendors by and large were pretty optimistic. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they tended to point a lot more to the sort of institutional barriers to change than some of the technical feasibility issues. And I think there's truth on both sides of those. I think both of them can be real issues. You know, I go back to the interview, the survey response from the municipal agency that wanted to be doing left turns specifically at intersections as their clearance strategy. And then they got a bunch of routes back that did right turns. And they said, okay, these routes are junk. They're not worthwhile for us. There isn't sort of a mathematical technical reason that you couldn't prioritize left turns over right turns, or even at individual intersections mandate that left turn. So I do think that some of the technical stuff is really a communication problem, which I hope that this project helps to address, at least highlights where those issues are. Yeah, so I guess the short answer, Scott, I wouldn't be too despondent, but definitely it is a tricky problem, you know, and harder to do with snow and ice control than, you know, a letter carrier where, you know, it doesn't matter what road they're going down, sort of the same process.
All right, anybody else?
Hi, this is Cliff Spoonmore, Wyoming DOT. When you answered Scott Lucas's first question, it kind of led to the idea when I was hearing it that, well, if you've got one of those 3 locations that you know is much better than any place else, then all we're going to do is confirm that that's the right thing to do, instead of actually plugging it in and allowing the system to confirm it without any prejudged items in it. Did I misunderstand that response? Maybe that's what I did. I misunderstood it. So please clarify a little more, please.
Yeah, I may not have been clear there, Cliff. The optimization software would output a set of results that would allow you to evaluate the relative effectiveness of all of your target locations, right? You could have route times, costs for each option, and that would be with no assumptions from you about which one is best. The point that I was trying to make is that if after that process one came out as clearly the best option amongst the 3, which may or may not be intuitive before you start that process, then some of the subsequent steps you could limit to doing to that best option, rather than doing the, you know, detailed route review and route revisions for all 3 alternatives, if after that process you know you're just going to be doing one. But the optimization software would be helpful in determining which one is the best. If it's so straightforward, if you've got 3 options that you're thinking about, but on the front end you already know which one's going to be the best, I mean, then maybe you just run it with that location and you don't include the other 2 if it's that sort of self-evident. But the optimization process could help you differentiate among different options.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Any other questions or comments?
I guess I had one more. Looking at the different route optimizations and that, and I don't know if I asked this question actually in the email before or not, but for the drivers inside there, if they are going to do some live turns, like a storm changes, something like this, and they want to do a different routes for the drivers while they're on the road, how are they getting that information? And then did a lot of, I guess, states use like turn-by-turn directions? Did they use maps? Did they use just a voice to tell them when to turn? Because I think a lot about auxiliary drivers and the new drivers in that don't know the routes. How do they actually get that information?
Yeah, so in answer to your first question about sort of changing routes based on storm conditions, most of these projects and the way these guidance documents are set up are not going to be producing sort of a dynamic optimization. So it's not going to be shifting routes in real time. Colorado DOT, this is discussed in the task 3 memo about with the DOT interviews, and I think also it's in the final report, is looking at building a dynamic tool, and I think now FHWA is trying to do that as well. But most of these are to give you a set of base routes, which then you would still need to use your supervisor, your district manager judgment to adjust those in real time as needed. As far as providing this information to the drivers, the optimization outputs can be provided in sort of a number of formats, and then sort of conveying that to the drivers is a little bit of a next step. But the most common one would be a GIS layer, so something that you could open in something like ArcGIS that would show the roads and the turn-by-turn instructions. It may be feasible to then port those over to something like a Garmin or a TomTom or whatever is providing. If you've got an AVL system that includes GPS and provides turn-by-turn. I know a little bit less about that technology side of it, but the primary way that the routes is typically conveyed is in a GIS file that you would then have to convert, which you can print out as turn-by-turn instructions or make a map of, but then there'd probably be one more step to integrate that with most of the voice systems.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. Really appreciate your time. Jonathan, appreciate all of the work you did on this project. Again, I will be posting this to the project page of the website so you can review it at a later date, at your own convenience. So thanks again, everybody. Really do appreciate it.